The summer of 1886 had been cruel to West Texas, but August was something else entirely. August was punishment. The sun hung in a white sky like a branding iron pressed against the earth, and the land beneath it cracked and split and surrendered. In the town of Garnet, the wells were dying. One by one, the shallow holes that settlers had punched into the dry caliche soil coughed up mud, then dust, then nothing at all. The creek that gave the town its lifeblood had retreated to a chain of stagnant pools where cattle stood belly deep, too weak to fight the flies that swarmed their eyes. Orson Tate, who owned more cattle and more land than any man in the county, stood at the edge of his ranch's main well and stared into darkness. The bucket came up empty for the third morning running. 3,000 head of longhorn depended on that well. 3,000 head that were now, effectively, dead on their feet. 7 miles east, where the land rose toward a low mesa that the Comanche had once used as a lookout, Virgil Dunham hauled a bucket of cold, clear water from a hole in the earth that went down 204 feet. He poured half into a trough for his dark bay gelding, Cinder, and drank the rest himself. It tasted of limestone and deep places, of ancient rains that had fallen before any white man set foot in Texas. The well had not faltered. The well would not falter. It was drawing from a source that drought could not reach, and Virgil had known this when he dug it, which was why he had kept digging long after every man in Garnet had told him to stop. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked west, toward the dust cloud that hung permanently over the dying town. They would come soon, when the last well in Garnet gave out, when the livestock began to drop, when the children cried for water that did not exist. They would remember the fool on the mesa. They would remember the well they had mocked, and Virgil Dunham would give them water. Because water, like mercy, was not something a decent man withheld. He had come to Texas in the spring of 1883, a widower of 47 with calloused hands and a quiet manner that some mistook for simplicity. His wife, Nell, had died of consumption the previous winter in Pennsylvania, where Virgil had spent 20 years digging wells and laying stone foundations for the farms and towns of the Allegheny foothills. He knew rock. He knew water. He knew how the two conspired together beneath the surface, how underground rivers carved channels through limestone, how aquifers collected rainfall from decades past and held it in vast hidden reservoirs, safe from the evaporation that robbed surface water in days. After Nell's passing, there was nothing to keep him east. Their children were grown, a son in Pittsburgh, a daughter married in Philadelphia, and the house they had shared felt like a coffin for a life that had ended. He sold everything, bought a wagon and a horse, and pointed himself toward the setting sun. West Texas was not a place that welcomed newcomers warmly. The land was harsh, the water scarce, and the men who had already established themselves there did not appreciate competition. But Virgil was not seeking to compete. He was seeking to disappear into work, to lose his grief in the honest labor of building something from nothing. He found the mesa 7 miles east of Garnet and knew immediately that he had found what he was looking for. The geological signs were unmistakable to a man of his experience. The limestone formations, the angle of the strata, the particular species of deep-rooted mesquite that grew along the base, all of it spoke of water far below. Not the shallow, unreliable water that the settlers of Garnet relied upon. Water that sat 20 or 30 feet beneath the surface in thin layers of sand and gravel, vulnerable to every dry spell. This was deep water, permanent water. An aquifer fed by rainfall that had percolated down through centuries of stone. He filed a claim on 160 acres that included the mesa. The land was considered worthless, too rocky for farming, too far from town for convenience, too elevated for easy access. The claim cost him $7. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Whether you're in the mountains, the plains, or somewhere the sun burns just as fierce, these lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the crisis finally arrives. Virgil began digging in June of 1883. He started where the mesquite roots told him to start, at a point near the base of the mesa where the limestone showed a particular pattern of weathering that indicated fractures below, channels through which water would flow. The first 20 feet were easy. The soil was loose caliche and sand, and his shovel bit into it readily. But at 20 feet, he hit rock, solid Edwards limestone, the ancient reef that underlaid much of West Texas. This was where most well diggers stopped, where most settlers declared they had gone deep enough, where they lined their holes with stone and lowered their buckets and congratulated themselves on a job done. Virgil kept digging. He switched from shovel to hammer and chisel, breaking the limestone inch by inch, hauling the rubble up in buckets on a rope and windlass. It was brutal, solitary work. Each day he descended into the growing shaft at dawn and did not emerge until dark. Cinder waited patiently above, occasionally peering over the edge with the mild curiosity of a horse who could not fathom why his master preferred to spend his days underground. By August, the well was 60 feet deep, and Virgil had not struck water. The people of Garnet, who had been watching his progress with idle curiosity, began to take active interest, not in his success, but in his failure. Orson Tate rode out to inspect the operation one September morning. Tate was the biggest cattleman in the county, a lean, weathered man with an iron-colored beard and eyes that appraised everything they saw in terms of its usefulness to him. He had come to Texas after the war, built his ranch from nothing, and now controlled water rights on 3 creeks and 6 wells. Water was power in West Texas, and Tate understood power. He sat his horse at the edge of Virgil's shaft and peered down into the darkness. 60 feet, he said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man accustomed to being right. And nothing but dry rock. Not yet, Virgil replied, his voice echoing up from the depths. My wells are 22 feet deep, Tate said. Every well in this county is between 15 and 30 feet. That's where the water is. You've gone past it. Your water sits in a shallow sand layer, Virgil called up. It'll last as long as the rains do and not a day longer. I'm looking for something deeper. Tate shook his head. You're looking for something that isn't there. You'll dig yourself to China and find nothing but rock and regret. He gathered his reins. But it's your time to waste, Mr. Dunham. Your time and your money. The story of the well spread through Garnet like brush fire. At Fenton's Mercantile, where ranchers and townfolk gathered to purchase goods and exchange gossip, the Pennsylvania well digger became a source of endless amusement. Old Dunham's down to 70 feet now, someone would report, and the laughter would begin. 80 feet, and still dry as a preacher's sermon. 100 feet, reckon he'll strike the devil's parlor before he strikes water. Horace Fenton, the mercantile owner, a heavy-set man with a perpetual sheen of sweat on his wide face, coined the nickname that stuck. Dunham's Folly, he declared, slapping his counter for emphasis. The man is digging his own grave and calling it a well. Mark my words, they'll find his bones down there someday, and not a drop of water to show for it. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now back to the story. Virgil heard the mockery when he came to town for supplies. He saw the smirks, the nudged elbows, the way conversations quieted when he approached and erupted into laughter after he passed. He said nothing. He had learned long ago that the opinion of men who had never dug deeper than their own ignorance was not worth the breath required to counter it. At 120 feet, he began to notice changes in the rock. The limestone was giving way to a softer, more porous formation, a layer of fractured sandstone that his experience told him was a promising sign. Water moved through such formations. It collected in the gaps between fractured stone, held there by impermeable layers above and below, like a vast underground cistern. At 150 feet, the air in the shaft changed. It grew cooler, damper. The rock wept with moisture, tiny beads of water appearing on freshly broken surfaces. Virgil's heart quickened, but he did not rush. Rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes at 150 feet underground could be fatal. At 180 feet, his chisel broke through into a cavity. Water surged up around his boots, cold, clear, sweet water that tasted of deep time and ancient stone. He stood in it, knee-deep, and allowed himself a rare smile. He was not finished. The cavity suggested a larger reservoir below. He continued to deepen and widen the shaft, creating a collection chamber that would fill reliably from the aquifer. He lined the lower section with fitted stone to prevent collapse, and built a windlass at the top with a heavy oak crossbeam and a 100-foot rope. At 204 feet, he declared the well complete. It had taken 14 months of solitary labor. The total cost, including the claim, tools, rope, and the stone for lining, came to $68. The well produced water, not the muddy, uncertain trickle that the shallow wells of Garnet provided, but a steady, clear, cold flow that never varied, regardless of the weather above. In the heat of summer, when the shallow wells slowed to a seep, Virgil's well poured forth, unchanged. In the dry spells that periodically gripped the region, when ranchers watched their water supplies dwindle with growing panic, the well on the mesa kept its ancient promise. Virgil built a modest stone house near the wellhead, laid out a small garden irrigated by hand, and settled into the quiet life he had sought. He sold water to those who would buy it, charging a fair price that undercut Tate's monopoly. He was not trying to make a fortune. He was trying to make a living. This did not sit well with Orson Tate. Water was Tate's weapon. He controlled the creeks and the shallow wells, and he used that control to dictate terms to every small rancher and farmer in the county. Need water for your stock? Tate would provide it, for a price, or for a favor, or for a piece of your land. His empire had been built not on cattle alone, but on the thirst of others. A man with an independent water supply was a man beyond Tate's reach. Worse, a man selling water cheaply was a direct threat to Tate's power. Tate began a campaign to discredit the well and its owner. The water from that depth is unwholesome, he told anyone who would listen, full of minerals and poisons. It'll sicken your stock and rot your teeth. The man's a fraud from Pennsylvania, selling snake oil to desperate fools. Some believed him, many did. Tate's word carried weight in a county where his money paid for most things. But those who had tasted Virgil's water, cold and sweet and clean, knew better. A quiet trade continued, conducted with the discretion of men who did not wish to anger the most powerful rancher in the county. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now back to the story. The year 1886 began dry and grew drier. January brought no rain. February brought wind and dust. March, April, May. The sky remained a pitiless blue vault, empty of clouds, empty of mercy. The grass turned brown, then gray, then crumbled to powder beneath the boots of men who walked across it with growing dread. The shallow wells began to fail in June. Tate's main ranch well, the deepest of his holdings at 28 feet, dropped to a trickle by mid-month. His secondary wells, scattered across the range, went dry one by one, like candles being snuffed. The creeks that had sustained his cattle shrank to puddles, then to damp stains in the dust, then to nothing. 3,000 head of longhorns stood in the blazing sun and began to die. Garnet itself was no better off. The town well, a public utility dug to a depth of 22 feet, produced a brackish ooze that smelled of sulfur and tasted of desperation. Families rationed their water to a quart per person per day, then a pint. Children grew listless. The elderly stopped leaving their homes. Horace Fenton closed his mercantile when he could no longer clean his floors or wash his hands. He sat on the boardwalk outside his shuttered store and stared at the dust-choked street with the hollow expression of a man watching his livelihood evaporate. The deaths began in July. An infant, the Morales family's youngest, succumbed to what the doctor called heat sickness, but everyone knew was thirst. A week later, 2 elderly brothers, the Hatchet twins, were found dead in their cabin, their water barrel bone dry. Cattle carcasses began to appear along the roads, bloated and stinking, drawing vultures that circled in slow, patient spirals against the white sky. 7 miles east, on the mesa that nobody had wanted, Virgil Dunham's well-produced water, as it always had, cold, clear, steady, 200 feet below the dying surface. The ancient aquifer held its reserves like a miser holds gold, indifferent to the catastrophe above. Virgil had watched the drought develop with growing concern. He had seen droughts before, in Pennsylvania and on the journey west, but nothing like this. This was biblical. This was the land itself dying of thirst. He did not wait for them to come to him. On a July morning, he loaded 4 oak barrels onto his wagon, filled each one from his well, and drove Cinder toward Garnet. The wagon creaked under the weight. Water is heavy, 8 pounds to the gallon, and 4 full barrels meant over 1,000 pounds of liquid salvation rolling slowly across the parched prairie. He arrived at mid-morning and pulled up beside the dry town well. A crowd gathered almost immediately, drawn not by curiosity, but by the sound of water sloshing in barrels, a sound that had become as rare and precious as music. Virgil climbed down from the wagon, opened the first barrel, and began filling buckets. "No charge," he said to the first woman who approached, a gaunt creature with a baby on her hip and desperation in her eyes. "Bring your vessels. Take what you need." The line formed within minutes. Half of Garnet was there by noon, carrying pots and pans and buckets and jars, anything that would hold water. Virgil filled them all, barrel after barrel, making 3 trips back to the mesa that first day. He returned the next day, and the next, and the next. For 6 weeks, through the worst of the drought, Virgil Dunham hauled water from his deep well to the people of Garnet. He rose before dawn each morning, filled his barrels, drove the 7 miles to town, distributed his cargo, drove back, refilled, and repeated the journey until dark. Cinder, the dark bay who had watched his master dig for 14 months without complaint, now hauled water with the same patient endurance. Virgil fed more than the people. He watered their gardens, their remaining livestock, their hope. He asked for nothing in return, though many offered what they could: a promissory note, a piece of dried beef, a word of thanks spoken with the gravity of prayer. Orson Tate watched from his failing ranch with a mixture of shame and fury. His cattle were dying by the hundreds. His wells were dust. His creeks were memory. And the man he had called a fool, the man whose well he had dismissed as folly, was saving the town that Tate had once controlled through his monopoly on water. It was Tate's foreman, a weathered man named Polk, who finally spoke the truth his employer could not bear to hear. "Mr. Tate," Polk said carefully, "we've lost near half the herd. We'll lose the rest inside a week unless we find water. There's only one well in this county that's still producing." Tate said nothing for a long time. He stood on his porch and looked east toward the mesa, toward the thin line of dust that marked Virgil's wagon making its daily journey. "Saddle my horse," he said finally. He rode alone to Virgil's claim. It was the first time he had visited since that September morning 3 years before, when he had peered into the shaft and pronounced it a waste of time. Virgil was at the wellhead, filling barrels for the afternoon run. He saw Tate approaching and straightened up, waiting. Tate dismounted. He stood before the well, the Folly, as he had helped to name it, and looked at the clear water flowing into the barrel. He looked at the stone house, modest but solid. He looked at the garden, still green in a landscape of death. "Mr. Dunham," he said. His voice was rough, stripped of its old authority. "I have come to ask for water, for my cattle, what remains of them." Virgil studied the man. The iron-colored beard was grayer now. The appraising eyes held something they had never held before: uncertainty. "Your cattle are welcome to water," Virgil said. "Drive them to the mesa. I'll open the flow into the lower basin." Tate nodded stiffly. Then he stood there, as if waiting for something more to be said, or unable to leave without saying it himself. "I told men your water was poison," he said quietly. "I told them you were a fraud. I tried to destroy your trade because it threatened mine." He paused. "I was wrong. About the water. About you. About all of it." "I know," Virgil said. "You're not going to make this easy for me, are you?" "Mr. Tate, there is nothing easy about drought, or about admitting error. You've managed one of those today. I reckon that's enough for any man." He handed Tate a cup of water from the well. "Drink, then go get your cattle." Tate drank. The water was cold and clean, drawn from a depth that drought could never touch. He closed his eyes and drank again. "Thank you," he said. The words seemed to cost him something. "Don't thank me," Virgil replied. "Thank the aquifer. It's been down there for 10,000 years, waiting for someone stubborn enough to reach it. When the rains finally returned in September, tentative at first, then generous, then glorious, the county had lost over half its cattle and a dozen of its people. Garnet had survived, but barely. Without Virgil's water, the doctor estimated, the death toll would have been 5 times higher. A gathering was held at the church in October. Every surviving resident of the county attended. The pews were full, the aisles packed, the doors thrown open for those who could not fit inside. Orson Tate asked to speak first. He walked to the front of the assembly, a man visibly diminished, and faced his neighbors without pretense. "For 10 years I have controlled the water in this county," he said. "I use that control to enrich myself at your expense. I set prices that desperate men had no choice but to pay. I called it business. It was not business. It was cruelty dressed in commerce." He drew a long breath. "When Virgil Dunham dug his well, I mocked him. When he struck water I couldn't reach, I tried to poison your trust in him. When the drought came, I had nothing to offer you but empty wells and excuses." His voice broke. "Mr. Dunham offered you water, freely, without condition. He drove 14 miles a day for 6 weeks to keep this town alive. He saved my cattle when I had given him every reason to let them die." He turned to face Virgil, who sat in the last pew, hat in his hands. "I owe you a debt I cannot repay, Mr. Dunham. All I can offer is the truth. I was a selfish man, and you showed me what generosity looks like. I am ashamed, and I am grateful." The church was silent. Then, one by one, others rose. Horace Fenton, who had coined the name Dunham's Folly, apologized with tears on his wide face. Ranchers who had believed Tate's lies about poisoned water confessed their error. Mothers who had fed their children from Virgil's barrels offered their thanks. When the confessions were finished, Virgil stood slowly, his bad knee protesting, as it always did. "I appreciate your words," he said simply, "but I did not dig that well to prove anything to any man. I dug it because I understand water, I understand rock, and I understand that the things worth reaching are usually the things that require the most effort to find." He looked around the room. "Every one of you has land. Beneath that land, at depths your shallow wells never touched, there is water. Permanent water. Water that will not fail you in drought, will not freeze in winter, will not run dry when you need it most." He paused. "I will teach any man who wishes to learn how to find it and how to reach it. It will take work. It will take patience. But when you have finished, you will never thirst again, and no man will ever control you through your need for water." Thank you for watching this story about Virgil Dunham and the deep well of Garnett, Texas. In times of plenty, patience looks like foolishness. In times of drought, it looks like salvation. If this story reminded you that the deepest sources are always the most reliable, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Tell us in the comments, have you ever kept working on something long after others told you to stop? By the following spring, 7 new deep wells had been sunk across the county, each one drilled under Virgil's supervision to depths of 150 feet or more. The aquifer, that ancient reservoir of patience, supplied them all without complaint. Garnett would never again depend on shallow water or the mercy of one man's monopoly. Orson Tate paid for 3 of those wells from his own diminished fortune. It was, he told Virgil, the first money he had ever spent that made him feel like a decent man. The phrase "digging a Dunham" entered the local vocabulary. It meant going deeper than anyone thought necessary, reaching past the easy answers to find the ones that lasted. It was spoken with respect, with a knowing nod, as if the speaker understood something about persistence that could only be learned the hard way. Horace Fenton reopened his mercantile and hung a hand-lettered sign above the door. "Dunham's Folly was our salvation." It remained there for 40 years, until the building was torn down to make way for a new courthouse. Virgil Dunham lived on the mesa for another 23 years, passing in the autumn of 1909 at the age of 73. He never remarried, though he was no longer alone. The community that had once mocked him came to regard him as its most valued citizen, and there were few suppers at which he was not a welcome guest. His well still produces water to this day, cold and clear, drawn from depths that drought has never reached and never will. On the stone rim of the wellhead, carved in Virgil's own hand sometime in the years after the great drought, are words that have outlasted the man who wrote them. The patient earth rewards the patient hand. Nell, who had loved his stubborn nature, would have smiled